It was 3017 in the morning, and I was sitting on the floor of a hospice bathroom in Wellesley, holding my mother's wedding ring in my palm, because the funeral home wouldn't take her until sunrise. The tile was cold through my jeans. Somewhere down the hall, a nurse was changing sheets in a room that no longer had my mother in it. I had not eaten in 19 hours. My phone was at 4%. I am Whitney, I'm 31, and the woman I had just watched die over 41 days of pancreatic cancer was the only person in my family who had ever told me she loved me without doing the math first. My fingers were trembling so badly I dropped the ring twice before I could type. The family group chat was named Hartwell Family Updates Only because my Uncle Theodore had renamed it that 2 weeks earlier when my texts about Mom's morphine schedule were apparently creating an unhelpful atmosphere. I typed it slowly. Mom passed at 2:54 a.m. She wasn't in pain at the end. I'm still at the hospice. Please come. 3 minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was a forwarded image from my Aunt Margaret, Mom's older sister and the unofficial general of the Hartwell name. The photo was a screenshot of an Instagram post she had just published, a black and white portrait of my mother from 1987, taken at her debutante ball at the Chilton Club. Underneath it, in elegant serif font, was a caption about grace, legacy, the quiet dignity of the Hartwell women, and a private grief that asks for respect, not intrusion. 84 likes already. A comment from the wife of a state senator. A heart from the woman who chairs the Boston Symphony Board. She had posted my mother's death announcement on Instagram before she texted me back. Have you ever watched the people who were supposed to bury someone with you turn that funeral into a brand opportunity? If you have, stay with me. Tell me in the comments later. I need you to understand who these people are before I tell you what they did next. Because what they did next is the worst thing anyone has ever done to me. And I still can't believe a single bit of it actually happened. To understand the Hartwells, you have to understand the house on Brattle Street. It's a yellow federal-style place in Cambridge with original 1798 floors and a portrait of my great-great-grandfather hanging above the dining room fireplace. He invented a kind of textile loom and made the family rich before the Civil War. We have been coasting on that loom money for almost 200 years. Most of my cousins do not work. They sit on boards. They host fundraisers for the Museum of Fine Arts. They have summer places in Manchester by the sea and winter places in Naples, Florida, and they speak about money the way nuns speak about sex. Never directly, never out loud, only in coded glances at the silverware. My mother, Caroline Hartwell, was the disappointment. She married a high school history teacher from Lowell. My father, Daniel, who died when I was 9. She refused to send me to Windsor or Dana Hall. She put me in Cambridge public schools and made me ride the city bus. She thought the Hartwell Foundation was, in her words, a tax shelter, pretending to be a soul. My Aunt Margaret had never forgiven her for any of it, and when my father died, Margaret descended on our little Somerville duplex like a colonel taking over a forward operating base. She arranged the funeral. She picked the hymns. She told my mother what to wear, and from that day on, my mother became smaller, and Margaret became the family. I became the second disappointment. I'm a public defender. I represent people who can't afford lawyers, addicts, teenagers caught with their cousin's gun, women who finally hit back after 20 years and now get charged with the assault. My salary is $68,000 a year before taxes. I drive a 2014 Honda Civic with a cracked side mirror. At Hartwell Christmas dinners, when one of my cousins would ask what I was working on, the table would go quiet. The way a room goes quiet when someone mentions a yeast infection. Whitney is so passionate, Margaret would say, the way you say so passionate about a dog that won't stop barking. When Mom got diagnosed in late August, I moved into her condo in Newton. The same day. I left a half-eaten sandwich on my own kitchen counter and didn't come back to it for almost 6 weeks. The cancer had already eaten through to her liver. The oncologist sat us down in a small windowless room and told us we were talking about weeks, possibly 2 months. My mother held my hand and said, "Well, then I want grilled cheese for dinner." She was 63 years old. I sent the first update to the family chat that night. Mom was diagnosed today with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors say weeks, not months. She is asking to see family. Please come. Within the hour, Margaret had called me. Her voice was low and careful, the way it always is when she's about to redirect you. Whitney, sweetheart, your mother is a very private person. The last thing she needs is a parade of relatives crowding into her bedroom. Let me coordinate. Let me handle the communication. You focus on her. I was so tired, I said okay. I will spend the rest of my life regretting that I said okay. For 41 days, I watched my mother shrink. She went from 138 pounds to 91. Her hair, which had been the same chestnut color as mine, fell out in handfuls onto the bathroom rug. I learned how to crush oxycodone into applesauce. I learned how to change a bedpan without making her feel ashamed. I learned that there is a specific yellow tone that skin turns when the liver gives up, and that hospice nurses call it the lemon look when they think you can't hear them. I texted the family chat every other day. Mom slept 8 hours last night. She ate half a piece of toast. She asked about Aunt Margaret today. She asked about Uncle Theodore. She wants to know if anyone is coming. The replies, when they came, were these small clipped things. A single heart emoji from my cousin Spencer. A thinking of you from my Uncle Theodore's wife. Margaret would sometimes write a paragraph. We are all holding her in the light. Please tell her how loved she is. Please remember to take care of yourself. Sleep is so important. But she would never say when she was coming. She just never said. Nobody came. Not one of them. Not for 41 days. My mother had 3 siblings. She had 11 cousins close enough to count. She had a brother-in-law who used to take her sailing on the Cape when they were kids. She had a niece who was her goddaughter and called her every Mother's Day. Not one of them walked through that condo door. Not one of them sat in the awful blue armchair by her bed. Not one of them held her hand while the morphine pump clicked. I held her hand. The hospice nurses held her hand. Her old neighbor, a retired postal worker named Bernadette, who I had met exactly twice in my life, came over every Tuesday and Friday with a thermos of homemade chicken soup and sat with my mother for 2 hours, so I could shower and cry in the parking garage of the Stop and Shop down the street. Bernadette brought a Bible some days and read the Psalms out loud in a voice like cracked leather. On the day my mother could no longer speak, Bernadette held her face in both hands and said, "Caroline, honey, you raised a good one. You did good." My mother nodded. That was the last conversation she had with anybody. Around week 3, I scrolled Instagram one afternoon while my mother slept. I do this maybe twice a year. I don't even have a real account. And I saw a post from my cousin Spencer's wife. A whole carousel. The Hartwells at the head of the Charles Regatta. Margaret in a navy blazer. Uncle Theodore laughing with a champagne flute. Spencer in Nantucket Reds. The caption read, "Nothing beats family weekends on the river." It was geotagged in Cambridge, 11 miles from the bed where my mother was forgetting how to swallow. I put my phone face down on the kitchen counter, and I went into the bathroom and I ran the shower so my mother wouldn't hear me, and I sat on the tile and I cried so hard I gave myself a nosebleed. I stopped sending updates after that. I didn't decide to stop. I just stopped. The next text I sent to that group chat was the one at 3017 in the morning telling them she was dead. So when Margaret's Instagram tribute came through that night before she even acknowledged my text, I understood for the first time what I had been living inside for over a month. It wasn't grief. It wasn't distance. It wasn't people don't know how to show up for cancer, Whitney. Give them grace. It was a wall, and somebody had built it on purpose, and I had spent 41 days standing on the wrong side of it, asking why nobody could hear me knocking. The funeral was 4 days later, at Mount Auburn Cemetery, which Margaret had selected because, in her words, it's where the family belongs. My mother had asked me, 3 weeks before she died, to be cremated and scattered off the Lowell Railroad Bridge where she and my father used to meet after his shifts. I told Margaret this. Margaret said, "Whitney, darling, that is not happening. You're emotional. Let the adults handle this." And then she went ahead and booked Mount Auburn, ordered a casket I didn't approve, and emailed me an invoice for $14,000 for the family share, which apparently meant my share. I paid it because I was 24 hours past my mother's death, and I could not form sentences. I will spend a year paying that credit card down. At the service, more than 300 people came. Almost none of them had been at the condo. The mayor's chief of staff was there. 2 senators sent flowers. The director of the Hartwell Foundation gave a eulogy in which he called my mother a quiet pillar of our family's century-long commitment to Boston's civic life. My mother hated that foundation. She had once described it in front of me as a tax shelter pretending to be a soul. I sat in the front row with my hands folded and I did not cry, because if I had started I would not have stopped, and Margaret would have used it later as evidence. Bernadette came. She wore a navy church dress and sensible shoes and sat alone in the back. She was the only person in that entire chapel who had touched my mother's hand in the last month of her life. The reception was at the Hartwell House on Brattle Street. Catered. White tablecloths. A string quartet from the New England Conservatory. Margaret floated through the rooms accepting condolences like a head of state. She was such a force. She was so private at the end. Whitney was a saint, just a saint. We all leaned on Whitney so much. I heard her say it 3 separate times. I stood by the bar drinking ginger ale and trying not to vomit on the rug. Around 8 o'clock, when I was already in my car in the driveway with the keys in the ignition, my phone rang. It was my cousin Thomas. Thomas is the only cousin I actually like. He's a journalist for the Boston Globe. He covers state politics. He had been in Albania reporting on a corruption story when my mother died, and his apologies for missing the funeral had been the only condolences that felt like they were addressed to me as a person and not as a Hartwell. "Whitney," he said, "I just got back. I need to come see you. Right now. Tonight if you can." Something in his voice. I put the car in park. "Tom, what?" "Not on the phone. Tell me where you are." I told him I was sitting in his aunt's driveway. He told me to drive to the diner on Mass Ave, the 24-hour place we used to go to in high school. He met me there in 20 minutes, still wearing the dress shirt he'd flown home in. He looked like he hadn't slept on the plane. He bought us both coffee. And then, he slid his phone across the table. It was an email thread. From Margaret. To Uncle Theodore, to Spencer, to 4 of the older cousins, to 2 of the foundation board members. Sent 23 days before my mother died. The subject line was Caroline's situation. Please read before responding. I read it twice. What Margaret had told them, the entire family bow, was that my mother had developed a severe psychiatric episode in response to the cancer diagnosis, that she was hallucinating, that she had become paranoid and verbally abusive toward Whitney, who, in Margaret's words, was bravely managing a very ugly situation with a parent who was no longer herself. Margaret had written that my mother's medical team had recommended strict visitor limitations to avoid agitation, and that my mother would not recognize or remember visits and might react with hostility. She had asked the family to honor Whitney's request for privacy and to channel any condolences or impulses to help through me directly, as I am coordinating with the medical team and with Whitney. She had attached a fake document. A letter on letterhead that looked like Mount Auburn Hospital but wasn't, signed by a Dr. R. Hennessy, attending psychiatry consult, recommending no visitors. I read it a 3rd time. My hands were not shaking. I felt very far away from my body, like I was watching myself from the diner ceiling. There was no Dr. Hennessy. My mother had never been confused. My mother had asked for her family every single day until the day she could no longer ask for anything. My mother had said, on the morning of day 29, "Whitney, do you think they're mad at me? Did you think they're mad at me? Did I do something?" And I had told her no, they're just busy. Mom, you know how Margaret is. Margaret had told them I had requested privacy. Margaret had told them my mother was insane. Margaret had told them the doctors had banned visitors. Margaret had forged a letter on hospital letterhead. Margaret had spent 41 days standing between my dying mother and the only people in the world she still wanted to see. I asked Thomas the only question that mattered. Why? He had already done the research. Of course he had. He's Thomas. He had spent the flight back from Tirana making calls. 2 months before my mother's diagnosis, my mother had quietly contacted the Hartwell Foundation's attorney about removing herself and her share of the family trust from the foundation's control. She wanted her portion, about $1.3 million, to be redirected to a community legal aid organization in Lowell, the one my father used to volunteer with before he died. She had wanted to do it while she was alive so she could see it happen. If she had completed the transfer before her death, the foundation would have lost a chunk of its endowment, and Margaret would have lost a chunk of her power, because Margaret's chair of the board is dependent on managing a certain dollar threshold. If my mother died before completing the transfer, the trust would default back into the foundation's general fund. Margaret had not wanted my mother to die alone. Margaret had wanted my mother to die quickly, quietly, and isolated from anyone who might help her make a phone call. Margaret had needed me too tired and too afraid to ask questions. Margaret had needed the rest of the family to stay away so my mother couldn't say goodbye to a niece or a brother who might mention, in passing, "Caroline, are you sure you've got everything in order? Do you need me to drive you to the lawyer?" She wasn't being callous. She was running a clock. I sat in that diner booth and I did not cry. I did not throw anything. I felt, for the first time in 41 days, very calm and very clear. I asked Thomas if he could forward me the email and everything else he had. He said he could. I asked him one more thing. I asked him if he was willing to put his name on this. He said yes. He said, "Whitney, she did this to my aunt. She did this to my aunt. She did this to your mother. You asked me to publish it. I publish it." The next morning I called my mother's actual attorney, a woman named Frances who had handled the condo paperwork. I asked her if my mother had ever mentioned the trust transfer to the legal aid organization in Lowell. Frances was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Whitney, your mother signed the initiating paperwork 8 days before her diagnosis. The transfer required a second signature, in person, with a notary. We had it scheduled for September 14th. She was too sick to come in by then. I tried to bring the notary to the condo. Your aunt told me your mother was not receiving visitors, including legal counsel, on the recommendation of her psychiatrist. I asked Frances to email me everything she had. She did, within the hour. I called the executive director of the legal aid organization in Lowell, a man named Hector. I told him who I was and what my mother had been trying to do. He cried on the phone. He said my mother had called him in mid-August and told him she wanted to fund 3 new public defender positions in her husband's name. He said he had been wondering for weeks why he hadn't heard from her. I told him he was going to hear from her now. 2 days later, Thomas and I sat in the front parlor of the house on Brattle Street with Margaret, Uncle Theodore, Spencer, and the foundation's attorney. Margaret had agreed to the meeting because Thomas had told her, very politely, that he was preparing a story about the Hartwell Foundation's governance practices and wanted to give her an opportunity to comment. She wore pearls. She had her ankles crossed. She offered us tea. I took out a folder. I had printed everything. The email she had sent. The fake psychiatrist letter, with a signed affidavit from Mount Auburn Hospital's actual chief of psychiatry, confirming no such doctor existed on staff. Frances's correspondence. Hector's statement. The trust paperwork my mother had begun. Bernadette's signed letter describing my mother's mental state in her final weeks, alert and grieving and asking for her sister. Photographs I had taken of my mother on day 31, lucid, holding a copy of the Boston Globe, smiling. The receipt from Margaret's Mount Auburn cemetery booking, made 48 hours before my mother actually died. I slid the folder across the coffee table. I did not raise my voice. I told her she had 2 weeks to resign from the foundation board. I told her she had 2 weeks to fund, personally, the trust transfer my mother had wanted, out of her own assets, with interest. I told her that if she did not do both of those things, Thomas's story would run in the Sunday edition of the Boston Globe with her name in the headline. I told her that I had already contacted the Attorney General's office about elder financial abuse and forgery of medical documents, and that whether or not I pressed forward with that complaint depended entirely on her cooperation in the next 14 days. She did not say a single word for almost a minute. Her face went through 3 colors. Uncle Theodore stood up and walked out of the room. Spencer stared at his shoes. The foundation's attorney was already opening his briefcase to look at the documents. Margaret finally said, "Whitney, you don't understand the family." I said, "I understand it perfectly. That's what's new." I stood up. Thomas stood up. We walked out and we did not look back. 11 days later, Margaret resigned from the foundation board. She cited personal health reasons. The transfer to the Lowell Legal Aid Organization was completed within the month, with interest drawn from Margaret's personal trust. The Caroline and Daniel funded 3 new public defender positions, just like my mother had wanted. Hector named them the Daniel positions, after my father. He invited me to the dedication ceremony. I went. I cried for the first time since the funeral, sitting in a folding chair in a community center in Lowell, watching 3 young attorneys I had never met sign their employment paperwork in my father's name. Bernadette came to the dedication. She wore the same navy church dress. She sat next to me and held my hand. 2 weeks after that, my doorbell rang on a Saturday afternoon. I looked at the camera. It was Margaret. She had a small wrapped box in her hands, a Tiffany blue ribbon on it, and she was looking up at the lens with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It looked almost like grief. She rang the bell again. I walked to the intercom. I pressed the button. "Whitney," she said, "I brought you something of your mother's. I think we should talk. We're family." I held the button down. My hands were not shaking. "You were related to my mother," I said. "You were never her family. You can mail whatever's in that box to my lawyer's office." She started to say something else. I let go of the button. I went back to my couch. I sat down. I listened to my own breathing for a while. The doorbell rang twice more, and then it stopped, and I have not heard from her since. I'm telling you all of this from my mother's condo in Newton, which I haven't sold yet. I'm sitting at her kitchen table. Bernadette is coming over later with chicken soup, because that's what we do now, every Sunday, the 2 of us. Thomas calls me every week. Hector sends me updates from Lowell. Here's what I learned, and I want to say it out loud, because I needed someone to say it to me a year ago and nobody did. Family is not who shares your blood. Family is not who shares your lad's name on a brass plaque in a Boston foundation. Family is who shows up. Family is the retired postal worker with a thermos of soup. Family is the cousin who flies back from Albania. Family is the executive director in Lowell, who cries on the phone with a stranger. Family is the people who, when you are sitting on a hospice bathroom floor at 30:17 in the morning, holding a dead woman's wedding ring, are the first ones you can imagine calling. If the people sharing your dinner table this Thanksgiving are not the people you would call from that bathroom floor, you do not owe them another Thanksgiving. You do not owe them a phone call. You do not owe them an explanation. You do not owe them the version of you that smiles through their fundraisers and pays for their cemetery plots. You are allowed to walk away. You are allowed to build something smaller and warmer and truer in the wreckage of what they were supposed to be. I'm building it now. It's slow. Some nights are very hard, but it's mine. Have you ever had to learn the difference between the family you were given and the family you choose? Who is the person you'd call from the bathroom floor at 3:17 in the morning? Tell me in the comments. Tell me their name. I want to know who showed up for you. I think about my mother's last morning a lot. She was lucid for maybe 4 minutes. She looked at me and she said, "My name? Just Whitney." And then she said, "You're the best thing I ever did." And then she closed her eyes, and she never opened them again. For a long time after she died, I tortured myself with the question of whether she knew, whether she understood, in those final weeks, that her sister had built a wall around her bed, whether she went into that last sleep believing she had been forgotten by the people who shared her blood. I will never know the answer to that, and I have made peace with not knowing, because the question was eating me from the inside out. What I do know is this. Margaret did not become who she was overnight. She made small choices for 40 years that each felt, in the moment, like reasonable management of a difficult family. A controlling phone call here. A redirected condolence there. A story shaped a certain way at a dinner table. Nobody ever pushed back, because pushing back was uncomfortable. And Hartwells do not do uncomfortable. By the time she was forging hospital letterhead to keep my mother isolated, for $1.3 million, she had been practicing for decades. Cruelty is almost never a single act. It is a habit that nobody interrupted. The same is true of the rest of them. Uncle Theodore, Spencer, my cousins. They were not evil people. They were comfortable people. And comfortable people will believe almost any story that lets them keep being comfortable. If you tell a comfortable man that his sister has gone crazy and the doctors say to stay away, he will stay away. He will not ask which doctors. He will not show up unannounced with a casserole. He will forward your email and pour himself another drink. The wall around my mother was built by Margaret, but it was held in place by every single person who chose not to ask one inconvenient question. I learned that being good is not a feeling. It is a verb. It is the choice to drive to the hospice when you are tired. It is the choice to send the soup. It is the choice, if you are a journalist on a plane back from Albania, to spend the 7-hour flight making calls instead of sleeping. Bernadette did not love my mother the way the Hartwells claimed to love my mother. Bernadette just showed up, on Tuesdays and Fridays, with a thermos, and she did it without anyone asking, and she did it without anyone watching, and that turned out to be every single thing that mattered. I am 31 years old. I still drive the Civic with the cracked mirror. I still make $68,000 a year, but I sleep through the night now. I have 3 people in my life. I would call from a bathroom floor, and one of them brings chicken soup every Sunday. That is wealth I did not know existed when I was a Hartwell. If you are reading this and you are tired of pretending, you are allowed to stop. You are allowed to walk out. The smaller life on the other side is not a punishment. It is the first real thing you will ever own.